Hello everybody, welcome back to another tutorial series, and in this one we are working on painting this beautiful sunset and fields landscape using watercolours. Here you can see the final painting that we'll be working on in this tutorial, and so let's get straight into it. The reference and materials lists are attached to the post, and for the sketch outline all you need to do is a line down the centre of the paper. Now I am going to be starting off with the sunset, so doing the sky portion of the painting first, and I'm going to start off by mixing up the colours I need for this first layer. So if you look at the reference, you can see that the sky goes from a blue colour at the top down into a gradient of a yellow-orange colour. So I'm starting off by mixing up my blue, and I'm just getting lots of blue into the palette. I'm just adding the same colour at the moment until I've got enough of that in my palette to cover the whole of the sky. I do add a tiny bit of water just to make sure that it is a light enough wash. I don't want it too dark. And I did mix in a tiny bit of purple as well. Now you don't have to use the exact materials that I am using. You can use any set of watercolours that you have and any watercolour paper. I recommend using a watercolour paper that is meant for watercolours, because other type of paper like normal print paper won't work properly with the techniques that I'm using, and you're more likely to get warping and buckling. So you can also add a bit of Payne's Grey to darken up the colour a bit if you want as well. But really you can just use that blue and then it's into purple, or any blue you have. Again, you don't have to use the exact same colours I am using. It's just important to mix up a dark blue with a bit of water mixed in as well. And that's our first colour. Like I said, the blue is going to be at the top of the painting. And now we need to work on that bottom colour, which is a yellowy orange. So I've put some yellow in my palette as well as some bright orange, and I'm just mixing them together, those same colours, until again I've got a lot of that paint in my palette. Because I'm using pans, you can only get a little bit out at a time, so you've got to keep going in and grabbing those colours. But really you're just looking for a colour in between a yellow and an orange for that nice sunset look. As you can see, I have got tape as borders around my sketchbook. I'm using an A5 size sketchbook, and I've got 2 binder clips on the top and the bottom to help prevent warping. Once again, you can mix in a little bit of water into the paint to make it a bit more of a light wash, and so it's not so opaque, so it's a bit more translucent. I am using the Cotton watercolour set for this, and I'm using the, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's the Hamamule. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, the A5 sketchbook. So that is our second colour. So we've got a nice dark blue and we've got a orangey yellow. And then on my bottom palette, I'm just going to mix up a pure yellow so that we can use that for the brightest areas. For example, directly around the sun, where we want it to be nice and bright and we want it to glow. So just spend some time mixing up those colours. The reason I mix them first is because we are going to be using the wet in wet technique, where you pre-wet the paper and then add the colours. So if I was to wet the paper first and then mix the colours, by the time I'd be ready to go in and add the paint, the paper would be dry. So I always like to mix the colours for each layer first. And so now that I've mixed them, I'm just going in with some clean water on my paintbrush, and I'm just using that to wet the whole of the paper. But really we're only going to be working on the sunset part, the sky, for this first layer. But I'm just wetting the whole thing. And you want to make sure that you're getting into all of the corners, all of the edges, and you've got a nice even layer of water all over that paper. So I'm just going over it over and over again, just to make sure that I've got a nice even coverage and the whole of the paper is nice and wet. So let's start off with the top of the sky. I'm picking up some of that blue onto my paintbrush. And I'm using round paintbrushes for this painting. And I'm just going to start working that blue throughout the top half of the sky. Make sure you don't mix the blue too far down, don't add it too far down the sky, because we want to have the yellow at the bottom as well, and if you drag the blue too far down then you won't get that nice gradient. So just keep the blue to the top half of the sky, and you can see I'm just doing this sort of tapping motion to give the look of clouds. I'm leaving some gaps of white in between to give natural looking highlights and clouds. And so you can see that it didn't take me very long to do that, but we got a nice natural look. It looks like we've got some nice clouds in there because we've left those highlights. Remember, you don't have to go in everywhere with the blue. You can leave some highlights. Now I'm using a clean damp brush just to blend out the edges. You don't want your brush to be too wet, otherwise you will get a cauliflower effect, which is not what we're going for. You want it just to be clean and a little bit damp so that you can easily blend out the edges to give a nice soft look. Also, the more water you have on your paper, the more the colours are going to bleed out. So if you add loads of water to the sky, then it'll be a lot harder to control where that paint goes, because there's so much water there, it will bleed out so much more. So if you want to be able to control the paint a bit more, then don't add too much water when you pre-wet the background. So at the moment I'm just taking some more blue and I'm just adding some shadows and mixing up some more of that paint in a stronger concentration, so with less water. You can use the same colour, just add less water. And I'm just tapping it in the middle of where we added in that blue to start off with, just to add a bit of variety to the sky, to make it look more interesting. But you can see that I'm still leaving some highlights, because that is really what gives us the look of those nice fluffy clouds. Once again, I'm going in with my clean damp brush and I'm just blending out those edges into those highlights. So it's a nice soft transition. So if you guys want to create any more highlights, then you can also use that clean damp brush to pull up some of that paint, as you can see me doing now. Because my brush is damp, it soaks up that paint, and as long as your paint is still wet, it'll be able to pull it up to reveal more of a highlight. And I love doing this technique when I'm doing clouds. So once again, I'm going to pull up a couple more highlights. And it helps to add a nice texture to the painting as well. So continue to soften out the edges and add highlights until you're happy with the top part of the sky. So now that we've finished with the blue portion of the sky, it's time to work on the yellow-orange part, so the bottom part of the sky, also where the sun is. So to do this, we'll need to pre-wet the bottom half of the sky again, because by now it's definitely dried up. So if this area with your painting has dried, then you'll need to pre-wet this section again so that we can do the wet on wet technique. Otherwise we'll get lots of harsh edges. So now we're going to start off by taking the bright yellow, and I'm going to start directly around the sun. Now with the sun, we want that to be the brightest part of the sky. We want it to be really nice and glowing. So I'm leaving the actual sun white. I'm going to try and preserve the sun because we want it to be so bright. So we're going to leave the sun white, and then we're adding the yellow all around the sun and over that bottom half of the sky as well. And then I'm going in with the orange, and I'm using this to add some shadows in very much the same way as I did with the blue. And remember, the paper is wet, so the watercolours are going to bleed out. So when you're preserving the sun, don't paint the yellow too close around it, otherwise it will bleed out into the sun and you'll lose that highlight. It's okay, as long as the paint's still wet, you can always pull up the highlights for the sun like I will do in a minute. Now I'm going in with a darker orange. I wanted to add in some more shadows. And I'm just working this mainly around the outside of the sky, either end. And I'm again just tapping it throughout, leaving some of the yellow showing through and some of the orange to give more variety. But you can still see how I'm leaving the sun very bright in comparison. Also, one thing to remember is that watercolours do tend to dry a lot lighter than they look when they're wet. So don't worry if the paint looks a bit too dark. Quite often it will dry lighter and it will look how you want it to once it's dried. So you can see how some of my paint is bleeding into the sun. So I will need to fix that. Going in with a clean, damp brush, just like we did before, to create the highlights within the blue area. And I'm just using this to shape the sun. As you can see, it's getting it nice and bright again because it's lifting and soaking up that paint, that yellow paint around the sun. So I want a nice gradient between the blue and the orange and yellow. I don't want it to be a harsh cutoff point, so I'm using that clean, damp brush just to blend that yellow and that orange up into the blue to create more of a natural looking gradient. You can see how just blending that upwards has created a much softer look and it looks a lot more natural now. I'm also adding a little bit of blue into where the orange is, once again to try and create that transition. So already we've got a nice base down for the sunset. We've got our sun in and we've created that gradient between the two colours. Just going to add some more shadows. Also, when the watercolour starts to bleed out, you may think that you've done your shadows dark enough, but as it bleeds out, it will get lighter because the colour's spreading over a larger area. So you may notice that you need to go back in and darken up areas that you thought were already dark enough as the paint starts to dry. Also, don't worry if you don't get it how you want it to in one layer. You can always let it dry and then build up more layers. So I wanted to create some brighter sort of vibrant colours, so I'm tapping in some more yellow. And because the surface is still wet, you can see that it's nicely bleeding out into the oranges. And I'm using that clean damp brush just to blend and soften any harsh colour changes. Once again, I'm going in with my clean damp brush and just reshaping the sun, getting that nice and bright again. Make sure you keep on top of that whilst the paint is still wet, because as soon as it dries, it's going to be really hard to pull up those highlights again. I'm also going to use that brush to create some clouds, cloud texture like we did with the blue part of the sky. You can also use tissue to get the sun even brighter. That's really, really useful for pulling up the most watercolour possible. Tissue is great for getting that really bright highlight, as you can see. And then I'm just using that brush to soften out the edges because the tissue can leave some harsh edges. You can see how the sun is super white now. Just adding a little bit more orange. And don't worry if the orange colour is bleeding down into where the fields are meant to be. That doesn't matter because we're using dark greens anyway, so it'll cover it up. Plus, we kind of want the tops of the fields to have that orange colour because the sun is glowing down on them. So it's okay if the orange bleeds down a little bit into where the fields are. So now I'm mixing up some more blue, and I'm just going to go back in to the top part of the sky and just use this blue to add some more shadows, because I really wanted to darken the sky up a little bit more, because in the reference it looks like the sunset is at night, so I really wanted to give that the sun's setting. So we're going into night, so I wanted it to look nice and dark. So the background is dry at the moment, so I'm not using the wet in wet method anymore. For the blue part of the sky, I mean, the blue part of the sky has dried. So I'm just placing where I want the shadows to be, and then you can blend them out with a damp brush if you want to get it looking nice and smooth. I'm also adding some blue down into where the orange is to transition between the colours. And I actually decided that I want the whole of the sky to go darker, like I said, to create that sunset look. So I'm just adding that wash of blue over the whole of the top of the sky. You can leave yours how you want it, if you like how yours looks. But if you don't like how yours looks and you feel like you've made a mistake, then this is a great way to sort of fix and save your painting. Just go over it with a wash of blue. You can see how this looks dark now, the blue area. But I still want the look of clouds. So I will go in with a clean damp brush and just pull up some highlights for the clouds, as you can see. Just shimmying the brush to give the natural sort of shape of the clouds, that fluffy shape. And keep cleaning your brush in between each cloud that you do, because as it picks up more paint, it won't be as effective then on the next cloud. So you need to clean the brush and then dry it for each cloud so that it can pull off the maximum amount of paint possible. Once again, you can also use the tissue if you want to get a really bright cloud. So you can see how I'm cleaning the brush off onto the tissue to make it nice and damp so that it can pull off more paint. You can see that I do that quite a lot. And I'm just going to work my way throughout the whole of the sky, starting with the blue area first. And I'm just going to repeat this same technique create the look of clouds all over. And then once I've finished the blue area, I'll move on and do the exact same thing with the yellow-orange part of the sunset. But when you switch from doing the blue part of the sky to the yellow part of the sky, make sure you clean your brush because you don't want to accidentally get blue onto your nice yellow sunset. So make sure you give it a nice rinse and you dry it off before you go in onto the yellow part. One tip that I have for you guys is remember to do a variety of different shapes and sizes to your clouds to make them look as natural as possible, because if you do them all the exact same size and shape, then it's not going to look very realistic and it's just not going to look as interesting. It will probably look a lot more flat and boring, whereas if you add different shapes, different sizes, then it's just going to add more depth and more variety. So I'm nearly finished now with the blue section of the cloud. So I'm just working on this final corner over on the left hand side. You can see how quite often I switch to using the tissue just to pull up a bit more paint if I need to. If I need to pull up more than the brush lets me pull up. You can see how the sky looks a lot more interesting now that we've added in those highlights. And now I'm going to repeat the same process for the yellow part of the sunset. And remember what I said, it's really important to clean off your brush before you go in and use the paintbrush on the yellow areas, because you don't want to get any blue on the yellow areas. So I'm repeating the same process, and make sure the paint is still wet, otherwise you won't be able to do this. So you do need to work relatively quickly when you're doing this technique, because you need to do the whole of the sky whilst the paper is still wet. I'm going to add a couple directly next to the sun as well. So it looks like there's clouds kind of overlapping with the sun. I think that would look pretty cool. But as you can see, the paper is starting to dry, the paint is starting to dry, so it becomes a lot harder to remove the paint compared to when it's really wet. But you can lift up the paint even if it is dry. You'll just have to go in with a little bit more of a wetter brush, still not too wet, otherwise you might get a cauliflower effect if it's still a little bit wet, but a little bit wetter than you normally would, and then just scrub at the paint a little bit more, not too aggressively, otherwise you may damage the paper, but you need to reactivate the paint and then it should lift up. It probably won't lift up as much as it normally would when the paint's wet, but you'll still be able to get a bit of highlight. So I'm just going to finish off adding some highlights throughout the sky. Just repeating the same technique. And just keep looking throughout the sunset and see if there's anything that you want to adjust. We will be going in and adding another layer to the clouds later on. Once we've added a base layer to the fields, we'll come back and we'll add some more shadows. I'm happy with how this looks for the first layer. I'm going to create a few more highlights within the yellow part of the sky. So just continue with this technique until you're happy with how your sunset is looking. And so once you've finished doing that, that is it for this part. You can wait for that first layer to dry, and then in the next part we're going to be moving on to working on adding a base layer to the fields. So to start off with painting the fields, we're going to start by mixing up the colours that we'll need. So we're going to be mixing up a green tone first. So you can see that I've got lots of bright green into my palette. Just keep going until you've got quite a lot of that in your palette, because we've got to cover the whole of the field area. Just starting off with a generic green, and then I'm adding in a dark green to that to darken it up a little more. Mixing in some more dark green. And also a little bit of dark brown you can mix in as well. We just want a really nice rich dark green tone. Remember, it doesn't have to be the exact same colour as mine. Just use whatever paints you have and mix up a nice green, a dark green and a bit of brown. So this is quite brown, as you can see. So we do want it quite dark for this, because like I said, with the sunset it is at night time. Well, it's starting to get into night time, so we want the fields to be quite dark. Mixed in a bit more green because it was a bit too brown. And you can see that I've got quite a lot of that now into my palette. And I do want the colours to be quite opaque and dark, so we're not going to be mixing much water in with this. And I'm just mixing up those exact same colours, a tiny bit of black as well, until I get a nice dark green. And really at the moment I'm just working to get even more paint onto my palette to mix up a larger quantity. And again, we're going to be using the wet on wet method for this first layer on the fields. I'm happy with that, how that dark green looks. And so because we're using the wet in wet method, we just need to pre-wet the whole of where that field is. Now I'm only going to be pre-wetting that field part, not the sky. So you can see that I'm just adding water to that bottom half of the painting up until where you can see my sketched outline is. That's the only sort of sketch outline you can see. And now I'm going to take that dark green and I'm just going to spread this throughout the whole of the field. But I am going to miss out directly underneath the sun, because where the sun is glowing onto, it makes the field look a bit more orangey brown. So as you can see, I'm tapping this green in everywhere but the actual part of the field directly underneath the sun. Now that we've added the base layer throughout the whole of that field, I'm just going to go in with even more of that same paint and just build up the shadows even more and try and get it even darker. You can see that I'm doing a few little lines to indicate the look of the crops and the grass. So at the moment I'm trying to get the foundation layer as dark as I need it to be, and also add a little bit of texture by doing these little vertical lines, as you can see me doing here, to try and give the texture of a field. But at the moment we don't need to worry too much about lots of detail, but doing these little vertical lines which will soften out and bleed out, and will bleed out, that will just help to give the texture of a grassy meadow. You can see that I'm slowly building up more and more shadow into the painting by picking up more of that paint. And I'm just working it randomly throughout the field so that we've got a variety in values. And with this stage we're just doing the foundation layer, so you don't have to worry about getting in lots of details. That will be done in another layer. So now I'm going to mix up the colour for the area directly below the sun. So this is like an orangey brown colour. So I mixed up a little bit of a dark orangey red and some orange, and I'm going for this like reddish brown tone. And I'm just tapping that throughout the field directly below that sun. And it will look strange at the moment, but once we've built up all of the details and added some more shadows throughout the sunset, it will all come together and will make sense. I'm also tapping in a little bit of yellow right at the top of that field, where the sun hits it the most. And I'm just spreading out that colour further into the green to create more of a transition and to blend the colours together. Because you want it to slowly fade into the green colour. Adding in a few more lines for details. You can see I'm doing these little lines to help transition between that brown and the green. Getting some more paint and just continuing to do these little vertical brush strokes, just tapping the brush vertically. There we go, already it's starting to look like a nice grassy field. So keep working on this base layer until you're happy with how yours looks. Now I'm mixing up some brown, and I'm just going to darken up sort of sides of where that sun is, because it's brightest directly under the sun, and then it'll get into a darker brown before it goes into a green. You can see I'm doing these little tapping motions and getting in these tiny little details to help transition and to add some more detail. And you can see in the reference a few little details of the crops overlapping near the sun. I'm also adding in some brown throughout the field to add more variety to the colours and make it look more interesting. Also to darken it up a little bit. Add some more lines for the crops. And I'll repeat the same process on the other side. You can see that at the moment my paint is very opaque and thick because I want the colours to be nice and dark. Again, I'm adding a couple more details. So now I'm going to mix up some black into my palette. Mix up some more black and a little bit of green. A bit more green. And I'm going to use this to add some really dark shadows throughout the field, and I'm also going to add a nice silhouette effect to the little house that you can see in the reference. So some of it is going to look a bit more like a silhouette. And I'm just going to tap this paint throughout the field to add a couple of shadows and to add more contrast to the painting. You don't want to go overboard with the dark green. You don't want it to look too dark. Just adding a couple of little vertical details. A few bits of grass. So I'm just going to repeat this until I'm happy that the field has got enough shadows. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. Now I'm going to go in with some brown, some quite dark brown, and I'm going to use this to transition from that really light orangey browny red colour into the green so that there's a gradient. And I'm going to do this by adding in some details and by darkening up this centre part of the field and blend the brown into that green below it, so that there's more of a transition from the orangey yellow into the darker red into the brown and then into the green. So it's not just two completely different colours that just randomly meet. I want it to be more of a transition. And you can add in a few details to help create that transition effect. Just dragging that brown further down. And you can see how just by doing that, it's a lot more natural looking and the transition looks a lot more realistic and gradual. So now I'm going to go in and use the same technique that I used to create this clouds in the sky. And I'm going to use a much smaller brush for this. And I'm going to create some highlights within the field, some highlighted blades of grass and highlighted crops, and it's just the exact same technique, just on a smaller scale with a smaller brush. And instead of doing fluffy clouds, we're just doing little lines. And because this paint is darker, you'll need to wash your brush more often and clean it off in between, because the paint is more thick and opaque, and it is a lot darker. But I'm just using a clean damp brush to go in and create some little highlighted details to create the little crops within the field. I'm looking at the reference to look at the direction the crops are going in, the way they're growing, the way they curve. I'm not following the reference exactly, but I'm using the reference to see where the main crops are and for where the main shadows are and all of that stuff. You can see that just by adding in those few highlights, it gives it a lot more detail and it makes it look a lot more interesting. Gonna add another one, and I'm just gonna continue throughout the whole of the field and just repeat this process until you're happy that you've got in enough crops. You can add different thicknesses, add some that are thicker, and then add some really thin ones. But remember, you do need to clean your brush, wash it off and clean it quite often so that it can continue to pull up more paint. Otherwise, it will work for the first sort of highlight that you create, but then it won't work for the other ones if it's still dirty. What you may see me do here is that I'm going in and creating the highlight with my brush, sort of activating that paint, and then I dab over it with the tissue, and the tissue really pulls off that paint and reveals that really bright highlight. Now, if you ever get a highlight too bright and you think you made a mistake, you can always paint over it. So don't worry if you make a mistake, if you add too many highlights, or if a highlight doesn't look how you wanted it to and you don't think it looks very good, you can always go over it and paint over it, which is great. So I'm just going to continue for the next few minutes to go in and use this exact same technique to add highlights throughout the whole of my field. You do the same thing and keep adding the highlights until that you're happy with how your field looks, and then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. I'm also adding a few highlights throughout the middle part of the field. So I'm just tapping the brush, and remember, before you go into this lighter orangey red colour, make sure you clean off your brush, because if you're working on the really dark green areas and then go straight into the yellow parts here, then it's going to just get green all over it and it may ruin this part of the painting. So make sure you remember to clean your brush I just added a couple of little highlights there, a couple of little details. They weren't grass blades that I added or like crop stems. They're more like the little bits of wheat on the crop. And so I'm just going to continue to finish off adding in the highlights with my brush. Then once again, I'll come back to talk you through the next technique. So now I'm just going in and just using a clean brush to blend over that area just below the sun. Just lighten it up a little bit and just pull some highlights further into the sides next to it, to either side of that highlight. This time I'm doing the highlights horizontally to sort of map the clouds, the look of the clouds. You don't want to do too many of these. And I'm also going to start to add in a few details using my darker paint, especially to cover up that large highlighted section on the right hand side of the fields. First, I'm just finishing off, adding in all of these little highlights. Now I'm mixing up that dark green, reactivating it, and I'm just going in and adding in some details throughout this large highlighted area on the right hand side. So I lifted up a bit too much paint in this area. And I'm covering it up because I don't want this large highlighted section. And you can see that I'm using this small brush to add in lots of little detailed bits of crops and grass. And so that is pretty much it for the base layer on the fields. In the next part, we're going to be working on adding our second layer to the sky. So we're going to be darkening up the sunset, adding some darker yellows, darker oranges, and darkening up the blue part of the sky. So you can wait for this layer to dry before you move on to the next part. And so I'll see you all in part 3 of this tutorial series. Now we're going to build up a second layer of shadows onto the sunset. So I'm going to be starting off by working on the lower part of the sunset on the yellow orangey area, and because we're working on the shadows, we're going to be mixing up some darker colours. So you can see that I'm mixing up some orange, some intense orange with some of that darker orangey red that we use for the area directly under where the sun is on the field. So you can just mix up any more intense orange that you have. I'm also going to add a little bit of yellow to this. But really you just want to mix up a darker colour of the orangey part of the sunset, so that we can add some shadows. And I'm using my brush pen for this. And so I'm going to just take some of that paint on my brush pen and just work this throughout the darker parts of the sky. So I'm avoiding where we've got those nice light highlighted clouds that we added in with our damp paintbrush. So I'm avoiding those highlighted areas. I'm just working this paint in between those highlights. And I'm using the water brush pen so that I can create a nice gradient in and out of these shadows, because there's water in the brush pen that I can squeeze to then get a lighter value and transition out of these shadows a bit better. But you can use a normal paintbrush. It really won't make much difference at all what you use. I'm also adding a little bit of that orange paint just above the field, that sort of line above the fields. just to make those colours a bit more vibrant, intensify the oranges just by the field. And also over that part of the field that's just directly below the sun. Now I'm going to carry on building up those shadows throughout the clouds. So I definitely felt like we needed to darken up the sky. It was looking very pale, especially compared to the field, how dark the field is. So I knew I needed to go and darken this up a bit more with the second layer. But if you're happy with how your sky looks, if yours is already dark enough, then you don't necessarily need to go in and build up a second layer if you're happy with how yours looks. But if yours is looking quite light like mine is, then I definitely recommend going in and building up some shadows. So I just place the colours where I want them to be, and then I soften them out if I need to with my brush pen. Really, I'm just randomly tapping in the shadows in between where the highlighted clouds are. Adding in some more shadow. And getting the shadow as dark as it needs to be will add more contrast, which will give it more of a dramatic, intense look to it, which is what I'm going for. So already you can see how the bottom part of the sunset now looks a lot more intense, a lot more dramatic. Just adding a bit of orange right at the top part of the field where the sun is reflecting, where the colours would be reflecting onto the field. And I'm also gonna get some yellow because I want to add in some more vibrant yellows. It's not all about making it darker, it's also about making it more vibrant and the colours more saturated. So even the highlights directly around the sun, I want to be more vibrant and vivid. So I'm taking some yellow, this time with less water so it is more vibrant. And I'm just adding this around the sun, also to make the sun more dramatic, to make it more of a sort of, you can see that it's a lot more harsh and it stands out more. So I wanted to make the sun stand out more. So I'm going to keep working on the bottom part of the sunset until I'm happy with how it looks. You can soften out any edges that you need to. And then once I'm finished with that, I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step, which will be painting the blue part of the sky. So now we're going to move on to painting in the blue part of the sky. So we need to first mix up our paint, and I'm going to be mixing up the same colours as before, the same blue, and then we're going to just add less water so it's a bit darker. So you're using the same colours, just less water. just to create a darker version. You can mix in a bit of purple again to make it the same colour as before. And again, I'm going to be using my water brush pen for this, and I'm going to repeat the exact same technique that I did with the other part of the sky, this time just using a different colour. I'm still going to be working my way in between the highlights, not covering the highlights at all, and just darkening up wherever I can see that sort of mid-tone blue at the moment. So it's all about just building up an additional layer of shadow on top of where the blue already is. Again, I'll use my clean brush pen to blend out the edges because I want to avoid any harsh edges to my clouds. I want them to remain looking nice and soft. I just want to give the sky more of a dramatic look. And so for this part, there's not much else to say because I am just repeating the same technique throughout the sky. If you want to, you can use the wet on wet technique for this, if you prefer that method. So as long as the sky is completely dry, you could pre-wet the paper, pre-wet the sky using some clean water. Try not to scrub it too much, otherwise you may reactivate the paints. And then go in and tap on these shadows, and then it will bleed out and you'll get nice soft edges. So that's a great technique if you find it hard to blend out the edges yourself and get them looking smooth. It may be better for you to use the wet on wet technique where it naturally bleeds out and blends out to give you soft edges anyway. So I'm just going to continue for the next few minutes just to tap in these shadows using the clean brush pen just to blend out the edges. Then I'll come back to talk you through the next step. Now I'm just going to go in for a couple of minutes with my larger paintbrush, and I'm just going to do the technique where I'm lifting up some highlights. So I'm just creating a few more clouds using my clean damp brush. You can also use this to soften out any edges of the shadows, and you can see how our sunset now looks a little bit darker, a little more dramatic. So I'm using my clean damp brush just to smooth out the edges, get rid of any harsh and natural looking edges, and also just to go over any highlights I want to brighten back up. You can switch from adding in these highlights with the brush using this technique to going in and adding in some more shadows. So if you notice that you want to add in some more shadows, you can always switch back and go back in and add some more shadows. And just keep tweaking the sky until you're happy with it. Make sure you're happy with the shape of your clouds. How many clouds have you got? Do you need to add some more clouds in? Make sure you're happy with the shadows. Are your shadows dark enough? Are your highlights for the clouds bright enough? So for example, you can see I'm switching back to going in with my paint to add in some more shadows because I noticed areas where I wanted to darken up even more. So you can switch between the techniques that you're using as you notice something that needs changing. So I'm just mixing up the same colours again, the blue, the purple and a bit of Payne's grey this time to make it a little bit darker. And I'm just going in once more just to add in a few shadows. You could use a paintbrush to do this. A larger paintbrush would probably make this easier. So I'm just tapping in some shadows around the outside corners of the page. So I'm just going to continue to add in the shadows throughout the sky. Once again, still using the same technique and squeezing the brush pen when I want to release some water to help blend the paint and give it more of a transition, more of a gradual colour change. And now I'm using a clean wet brush to blend out the edges so that the shadows aren't too harsh. So that is pretty much it for the sunset. So now we've added multiple layers to the sunset. Now looks nice and dramatic. And in the final part of this series, we're going to be working on just adding in the details to the field, adding in the crops. So the next part is all about adding in the details and finishing off this painting. But I hope you're happy with how your sky is looking. Just keep tweaking it until you're happy with it. Just like I am. And remember, you can go back to the yellow-orange part of the sunset as well if you notice something that you want to tweak within that area. And so now that I'm happy with my sky, I'm going to wait for it to dry. And so I'll be back to talk you guys through how to add in all of the details. So I'll see you all in the final part. I'm going to start off by adding in the details directly around the sun because these details are not going to be like a green, dark brown, black colour. They are going to be a brown tone because the sun is glowing through them. So these details look a lot more warm toned and they have a lot more orangey brown shades to them. So that's the colours that I'm going to be using for these details. So I've just mixed up a bit of brown, a bit of orange and a bit of red in there, adding in some water because I want them to be nice and light. And I'm just going to start off by adding the details that overlap the sun. And because I've mixed in quite a lot of water, they are going to be nice and light. And when you're doing your details, you want to have some that are really faint and really light, and then have some that are darker, again, to just keep adding a variety. It really does help to add depth to the painting if you have some that are really faint and they look really far off in the background, and then some that are darker and harsher and so they look closer to you. So I don't know if this was like a wheat field, but I'm doing the little crops and I'm tapping at the end to give the look of the wheat. So I do the little stem, the little lines. So you want it to be thicker at the end. If anything looks too dark, then you can always go over it with a tissue to lighten it up. Like I said, I'm not following the reference exactly, but I am looking at it, especially when I'm doing these details, to see where the most details are, how long they are, how tall are these crops, especially some of the main ones, which way they're bending, how many is overlapping the sun, and is this lighter colour. So you can see that I'm working from the lightest details, which are these ones, and I'm going to be working and moving on to the darker details. So I'm working from light to dark with this. You can see that I'm doing a mixture of just individual lines and blades of sort of grass or tall grass and wheat. And then I'm doing ones that have got the little bit of wheat or corn or whatever it is at the end of them. So I'm doing the little tapping motion to create those little bits. And doing these parts, this nice warm orangey brown tone, is really going to help with the illusion that the sun is glowing through them and that this white circle is actually a really bright sun. Whereas if you did them like a green colour, it just wouldn't have that same effect. So if ever you've got plants or flowers overlapping the sun, then remember that the sun reflecting through them is going to have a big impact as to which colour they are. So I'm just going to continue to add in these little details with this colour. Try to have lots of fun with this, be creative. Don't worry too much about getting in every detail exactly like it is in the reference. That's not the point of this. Just look at the reference for the inspiration to see where most of the crops are, how long they are, which way they blowing and curving, but don't worry about copying each one exactly. You just want to get in the impression of the crops. So I'm just going to continue to add details using this brown colour, repeating the same process until I'm happy that I've got them all in. I'm starting now to add in some dark ones. As you can see directly below the sun, I did some darker details. And I'm not just going to be adding details above the sort of field, but I'm also going to be adding them throughout the field like you can see me doing now. So I'm just going to repeat this process with this orange brown until I'm happy that I've added in all of the details that I need to with this colour, and then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next part. So now that I've added all of the details with the brown, I've mixed up some dark green, and I'm just going to use this dark green to give the look of like a big bush or a tree in the distance. So I'm going to do one on the left hand side, and you can see that I'm just doing this tapping motion to build up the foliage in this area. Now I'm not trying to do this painting like photorealistic or anything, so I just want to get in the impression of the bush by doing these tapping motions to give the look of foliage and leaves. And because the bush is so far away, or this tree is quite far away, you won't be able to see every single leaf. They are just going to look like little dots. So doing this tapping motion is great for replicating the texture of the foliage. Just going to fill it in the bush. You can see that around the edges I'm doing more of these individual little tapping dot motions to give it more of an interesting texture around the edge. But for more of the middle, I'm pretty much just filling it in with the green colour a bit more. Tapping in some more shadows now with some of that darker green. Now I'm also adding a few little bits of tall grass, also overlapping with the bush as well. Adding some more shadow to the bush. Still doing that little stippling tapping motion. And I always use this technique for doing trees or bushes or any sort of foliage. I like to do that tapping motion. And I'm going to do the same sort of thing on the other side, but I'm not going to really be tapping vertically. I'm going to be going more horizontally to give a different sort of look for the tree. So this one's going to look like a slightly different type of tree. And by doing the tapping motions horizontally, it makes it look a lot more different and therefore more interesting because you're adding again to the variety. Whereas if I was to do the exact same type of bush on this side with no difference to it, it wouldn't look as interesting as doing a different type of tree. And that may sound obvious, but it's just important to keep in your mind that adding more variety, whether that's to the bushes or throughout the sky with the clouds, or throughout when you added in the details with the brown paint, or when you added in the highlighted bits of the crop, it's always important to add in more variety and not do everything exactly the same. Now I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the brown paint, but this time with green. This dark green. So I'm just going to go in and add in all of the tall bits of grass. Carefully looking at the reference, because I don't want to do them too long or add in too many. It's important not to go overboard with this. You can also switch to a smaller paintbrush so that you can get in even tinier details. I feel like just adding a few little wisps, a few little details really help to transform the field and make it look more interesting and more realistic. Just by adding in a few little lines. I'm doing the same thing throughout the field. Adding in these lines. And I'm going to repeat the same process over on the left-hand side of the painting. Adding a bit more water to my paint so I can get some lighter details. And so I'm just going to repeat this process. If you don't like how anything looks, how a specific detail looks, you can just go in with a bit of tissue and pretty much just remove it as long as it's still wet. So I'm just going to repeat this process, this exact same technique, until I'm happy with how all of these details look. So I'm just going to spend the next sort of 5 minutes doing this, and then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. At the moment, I'm working on adding the couple of big main crops that you can see in the reference. And these ones are quite close up, so they're nice and big. And because these are so important, I'm using a very light wash of colour first, so that I can just sketch them in and get the placement correct before I go and darken them up. And so I'm doing a very thin stem, and then I'm obviously creating the fanned bit of the wheat at the top. So I'm creating these little fanned brush strokes. And there's a couple of them over on the left hand side. They're all leaning towards the left hand side as well. So they're obviously very light at the moment, but a nice light wash is great for establishing the shape and making sure they've got the right placement, because it's a lot easier to remove a light colour than if you used to go straight in with a black paint, for example, and then realise you've made a mistake. So if you're ever unsure, you can always sketch it in graphite first, or just use a very light watercolour. So now I'm going to go in with a bit of a white watercolour mixed in with a bit of yellow to get this sort of cream colour. And I'm going to actually use this to paint in some highlights throughout the field. So I'm not using gouache for this, I'm just using the white watercolour from the pan, mix it with a bit of yellow so it's not so bright. And I'm just painting in a few little details to the crops throughout the field. And you can see that this goes really nicely over the top of those dark watercolours. And it helps to add some more detail, because you can see in the reference we can see a lot of highlighted bits of the crops within the field. We can see a lot of highlights in this area. So I'm just going to go throughout the painting and do this. If your white watercolour isn't really working as well as mine is, then you can use a bit of white gouache with some water mixed in, mix in a bit of yellow watercolour and do that, because gouache is a little bit, well, it is a lot more opaque than watercolour, so it will definitely stand out. But I found that using the watercolour worked just fine for this. It gave me the look that I wanted it to. So if you mix in more water with the watercolour, then you'll get more of a translucent look. Whereas if you leave the white watercolour really opaque with not much water mixed in, then your highlights will be a lot brighter. So I recommend, again, doing a variety. So have a bit of the watercolour that has more water mixed in, so you have some more subtle highlights, and then have some brighter highlights. So you've got more of a range of values. So you can see how quickly we were able to transform the field by adding in some of these details. I'm just going to continue for a few minutes to just go throughout the whole of the field and add in some highlights in the same way as I've been doing. Just repeating this process for the next couple of minutes. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next part. So now I'm going to add a little bit of brown to those highlighted crops. And I'm going to start to darken up those main crops that we've painted in earlier, that we've just got sort of a base layer on at the moment. So I'm just adding a little bit of a orangey brown over the top of those highlights, just to make the colour a bit more accurate, because it's a bit more brown in certain areas than it is green. So you can keep tweaking yours until you're happy with how yours is looking before you move on and add the shadows to the crops. And then once we've done that, we'll pretty much have finished this piece. So I'm taking this dark brown and I'm just basically going over those crops, going over the stem. I'm just basically tracing over where we added the paint with the first layer, just to darken it up a bit more. And what's great is we can see the first layer peeping through in certain areas. So we've got those lighter bits of the crop, and then we've got this darker second layer. So we've got a variety of values in this area because we're not completely going over that first layer everywhere. There's certain areas where it's still showing through, which gives us a really cool effect. Now I'm going to add another bit of crop over on the right hand side. Doing my tapping motion to give the look of the wheat at the end. And you can see how I've painted this one slightly differently than the ones on the left hand side. I've done more of a stippling motion to give this bit of the wheat a slightly different texture to all of the other ones. I'm adding in a few smaller details as well. But as you can see, we're pretty much finished with this painting now. There's not much else to do at all. So I really hope you like how your painting has turned out. I'm really happy with how mine looks. Now we're going to finish off this painting by darkening up those main crops a little bit more. So I'm just mixing up some black onto my palette, and I'm just going to use this to darken up a bit of these main crops, just to make them look more dramatic and to give the painting more of a silhouette look in certain areas, because I really like the effect of a silhouette watercolour. And so I'm just going to repeat this process for all of those main crops, just going over it with some of this black. So I'm just going to repeat this for the next minute or two. I'm also going to use that paint to darken up our bush on the left hand side a bit more. So I'm just stippling some of that dark paint throughout the bush just to add a bit more shadow. so it looks a bit more dramatic and it stands out a bit more. Once again, this is optional. If you like your painting having more of a brighter, lighter look, then you can leave it as it is. Like I said, I like the more silhouette look, so I'm going a little bit darker. By the way, it's only looking a bit brighter because of the way the light is reflecting off of the paint. I'm just going to add a few more details using that black paint. Adding some tiny details in between those main crops. And just use this paint to darken up any areas that you want to have that silhouette look to it. So you could do this with the house if you don't feel like that area is dark enough, or any of the darkest shadows throughout the field. I'm going to go over this main crop on the right hand side of the painting now. And I'm just going to spend the next minute adding in a couple more details with the black paint. But that is pretty much it for this painting and for this tutorial. Take this time to look at your painting and see if there's anything that you want to tweak and that you want to adjust. See if you need to add any more highlights throughout the field. Do you need to darken up the sky at all? So this is the time to tweak yours. Remember, yours will probably look different than mine, so there'll be certain areas that you need to adjust that I haven't changed on mine because I was happy with them. And there'll be areas that I may be tweaking and adjusting that you may already feel look dark enough on your painting and that you won't need to adjust. So try and analyze your painting on its own. The final thing that I'm doing is just taking some very opaque orange paint onto my brush, and I'm just creating some splatters over the field just to add more of an interesting texture and to add a cool effect to the painting. If you mix in some more white watercolour or yellow watercolour with that orange paint, then these little splatters will stand out a lot more because they'll look a lot brighter. But the splatters, again, is something optional that you can do if you like the effect that it gives. Now, once you've waited for the whole painting to dry, you can remove the tape from the borders if you have used any. I like using this washi tape, but remember to wait for the painting to completely dry before you remove the tape. As always with my sketchbook paintings, I finish them off by dating the painting. And for you guys that have asked, in England we put the day before the month, so it may look like this is sort of in the future, the date, but it's not, it's just the way we write them. So here you can see the final painting. I really hope you guys enjoyed following along with the tutorial, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye everybody.